The strangest thing about corruption is that it rarely begins with a suitcase full of cash. It usually starts with a single number that nobody thinks to question. My name is Ethan Carter, and until that Tuesday morning, I believe my neighborhood was one of the few places where people still trusted each other. Maple Ridge Estates wasn't luxurious, but it was peaceful. Children rode bicycles beneath rows of mature maple trees. Retirees waved from neatly trimmed porches, and every Saturday someone was always mowing a lawn before breakfast. It looked like the kind of community real estate agents described as stable and well-managed. Looking back now, I realize appearances can be the most expensive illusion anyone ever buys. The envelope was tucked neatly beneath my front door, crisp enough to suggest it had been delivered by hand instead of dropped into the mailbox. Across the top, bold black letters read, "Immediate HOA assessment notice." At first, I assumed it was another routine reminder. We all paid association fees. They covered landscaping, street lighting, and the small pond near the entrance where families gathered during summer evenings. I carried the envelope into my kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and opened it without the slightest concern. That feeling disappeared before the coffee had time to cool. According to the notice, my monthly HOA assessment would increase by nearly 60% beginning the following month. Below the new amount was a warning stating that failure to comply within 7 days would result in late penalties, legal collection fees, and possible restrictions on community privileges. The language sounded polished, almost rehearsed, as though whoever drafted it expected nobody to question a single sentence. I read the page again, then a third time. The figures still made no sense. As a civil engineer, I had spent most of my career reviewing construction estimates, municipal budgets, and infrastructure contracts worth millions of dollars. Numbers had a rhythm. Honest budgets balanced naturally. Dishonest ones usually left fingerprints hidden inside ordinary-looking paperwork. Something about this notice felt wrong. Before I could even explain why, my phone buzzed with an email notification only seconds later. The sender was Linda Brooks, president of the Maple Ridge HOA board. "Mr. Carter," the message began, "your revised assessment reflects the board's recently approved budget adjustments. Payment is expected no later than next Monday." No explanation. No supporting documents. No meeting minutes. Just an expectation that I would quietly pay. That afternoon, I walked to the community clubhouse carrying the notice folded neatly inside my jacket pocket. Linda stood near the entrance directing a landscaping contractor, her navy blazer perfectly pressed despite the summer heat. She greeted neighbors with practiced confidence before turning toward me with the same controlled smile she wore at every annual meeting. "There must be some mistake," I said, holding out the letter. She barely glanced at it. "There isn't. My increase is far higher than last month's. The board approved the new structure. I'd like to see the budget." Her smile never disappeared, but something behind it became noticeably colder. "Homeowners don't need to worry about internal budgeting," she replied. "Your responsibility is simply paying your assessment." For a brief moment, the sounds around us seemed to fade. Lawn equipment hummed somewhere across the street. Sprinklers clicked methodically over freshly cut grass. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the clubhouse without either of us looking away. I slipped the notice back into my pocket and thanked her politely. She probably interpreted my calmness as surrender. She couldn't have been more mistaken. Because the moment someone tells an engineer not to look at the numbers become the only thing worth looking at. And what Linda Brooks didn't know was that before this story ended, an ordinary HOA invoice would unravel a secret budget that had been hiding in plain sight for years. By the next morning, I had stopped thinking about the amount of money. It wasn't life-changing. I could have paid the increase without sacrificing anything important. But numbers don't bother me nearly as much as inconsistencies do. If someone tells 10 people the same story, the details should match. If they don't, either the story is wrong or someone wants it to be. The first person I spoke with was my next-door neighbor, Mark Henderson. Mark had lived across from me for nearly 8 years, and every Wednesday morning, he washed his pickup truck with the same faded garden hose while listening to classic rock loud enough for half the street to hear. If anyone would casually mention an HOA fee increase, it would be him. "Morning," I called as I walked across the driveway. He looked up and smiled. "Morning, Ethan." I held up my assessment notice. "Did your HOA dues go up this month?" He frowned for a second before drying his hands on a towel. "A little. About $15. Only 15. Yeah. What? I hesitated. No reason, I replied. Just comparing notes. He shrugged and returned to spraying water across the hood of his truck while I quietly folded the paper back into my pocket. $15. Mine had increased by nearly 4 times that amount. Maybe there were different property categories, I told myself. Different lot sizes. Different maintenance zones. I needed more information before jumping to conclusions. Over the next 2 days, I found excuses to have conversations that would normally seem insignificant. Mrs. Alvarez, who walked her golden retriever every evening, laughed when I mentioned the new budget. They actually lowered mine by $5 after removing the pool renovation fee. Lowered. That word stayed with me. Later that afternoon, retired firefighter Tom Richards leaned over his mailbox and said, "Mine didn't change at all. No increase. Not a penny." By Friday, I had quietly spoken with 9 homeowners. Every answer was different. $15 increase. No increase. Small decrease. Temporary adjustment. One family hadn't even received a notice. None of them matched the explanation Linda had confidently given me outside the clubhouse. The board approved the new structure. If that were true, why was every homeowner describing a different structure? That evening, I spread a legal pad across my dining room table. I wrote each address in one column, each reported assessment in another, and every explanation I had heard beside it. The page slowly filled with arrows, circles, and question marks until it looked less like neighborhood bookkeeping and more like the beginning of an engineering investigation. Patterns started appearing. The largest increases seemed oddly selective. The explanations changed depending on who asked. And nobody, not a single homeowner, could remember voting on a new assessment formula during the last annual meeting. That detail bothered me more than anything else. HOA budgets didn't simply appear overnight. There were procedures, notices, meetings, votes, minutes, documentation. Communities ran on paperwork. At least they were supposed to. Saturday morning, I stopped by the community bulletin board outside the clubhouse. The glass display case contained landscaping schedules, neighborhood picnic announcements, and last month's meeting agenda. I searched every page for any reference to a 60% assessment increase. Nothing. No announcement. No budget summary. No revised fee schedule. Just cheerful flyers advertising the annual barbecue and a reminder to keep trash bins out of sight after collection day. As I stood there reading the notices for a second time, Linda stepped out of the clubhouse carrying a folder beneath one arm. She noticed me immediately. "Looking for something?" she asked with her usual composed smile. I was trying to find the budget announcement. It's already been handled. I couldn't find any meeting minutes. Their internal administrative records. Her answer came too quickly, almost rehearsed. She gave me another polite smile before walking toward her car without another word. I watched her drive away, then looked back at the nearly empty bulletin board. Communities don't become dishonest all at once. They become dishonest one missing document at a time. And somewhere between my unusually high assessment and a budget nobody seemed able to explain, I realized I was no longer investigating an accounting mistake. I was investigating a story that nobody in charge wanted homeowners to read. By Monday morning, my dining room no longer looked like part of a home. It looked like the temporary office of someone preparing for an audit. Sheets of handwritten notes covered the table. HOA notices were stacked beside a yellow legal pad. My laptop displayed the association's public financial reports while a calculator sat next to an untouched mug of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. I wasn't trying to prove anyone guilty. I was trying to prove the numbers honest. If they happened to expose something else, that would simply be where the math led. The Maple Ridge HOA website wasn't impressive, but it contained exactly what state law required: a collection of annual budgets, reserve summaries, and meeting packets available for homeowners to download. Linda had claimed homeowners didn't need to concern themselves with internal budgeting. Apparently, the law disagreed. I downloaded the last 4 annual budgets and began comparing them side by side. At first glance, everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Landscaping, insurance, road maintenance, utilities, reserve contributions. The categories barely changed from year to year. That was exactly why one particular line immediately caught my attention: community improvements. The title sounded harmless enough. Every neighborhood invests in improvements from time to time. New benches, additional lighting, fresh landscaping, playground repairs. Except the number beside that category had nearly tripled over 4 years. I leaned back in my chair. Had I missed something? I closed my eyes and mentally walked through the neighborhood. The entrance monument looked exactly the same. The sidewalks hadn't changed. The clubhouse still had the same faded carpet from when I bought the house. The playground equipment was old enough that several parents had joked it belonged in a museum. The pond fountain still broke down every summer. So where had hundreds of thousands of dollars in community improvements actually gone? I opened another report, then another. Every year's budget contained nearly identical wording. No project descriptions, no contractor names, no completion reports, only larger and larger numbers. That wasn't necessarily evidence of misconduct, but it certainly wasn't transparency. I opened the meeting minutes hoping to find detailed discussions approving major expenditures. Instead, I found short summaries. Budget presented. Motion approved. Meeting adjourned. Entire financial decisions involving hundreds of thousands of dollars had apparently been summarized in fewer words than most people use to order lunch. That was unusual. Very unusual. I printed the reports and spread them across the table. Years of reviewing infrastructure contracts had trained my eyes to ignore explanations and focus instead on patterns. Patterns rarely lied. Expenses rose steadily. Reserve funding barely changed. Assessment income increased almost every year. Yet reserve balances seemed strangely stagnant. Money was coming in. Expenses were increasing. But visible improvements remained almost non-existent. I reached for a red pen and circled every number that didn't seem to fit. Soon, red circles covered nearly every page. One figure led naturally to another. Community improvements connected to vendor services. Vendor services connected to administrative expenses. Administrative expenses increased almost perfectly in proportion to the assessment increases. It was subtle, almost elegant. The kind of pattern nobody noticed unless they intentionally compared multiple years at once. Someone reviewing only the latest budget would never question it. Someone reviewing all four certainly would. Just after noon, another email arrived from Linda. The subject line read, "Friendly reminder." Inside were only 2 sentences. Your revised assessment remains unpaid. Please avoid unnecessary delays. No mention of the budget. No response to my request for supporting documentation. No explanation whatsoever. I smiled for the first time in days. People who have nothing to hide usually answer questions. People protecting something often repeat deadlines instead. Outside my window, children laughed as they rode bicycles past freshly cut lawns. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Orderly, peaceful, almost picture-perfect. But sitting in front of me were 4 years of financial reports quietly telling a very different story. I still couldn't prove where the missing money had gone. Not yet. But I no longer believed the inflated HOA assessment was the problem. It was simply the loose thread. And somewhere behind those polished spreadsheets, someone had woven an entire story they never expected a homeowner to unravel. The more I studied the budgets, the less interested I became in the numbers themselves. Numbers only tell you that something happened. If you want to understand why it happened, you have to follow the people receiving the money. That realization changed everything. Tuesday morning found me sitting in front of my computer before sunrise, the only light in the room coming from 2 monitors and the faint orange glow of the kitchen clock. Outside, sprinklers clicked rhythmically across neighboring lawns while birds argued from the maple trees lining the street. Maple Ridge looked exactly as it always had, peaceful enough that nobody would imagine its financial records deserved a second glance. I opened the annual budget again. Community improvements, vendor services, administrative consulting. 3 categories. 3 growing expenses. No names. No explanations. No invoices. Only totals. Public associations are careful about what they publish, but they cannot erase every footprint. Large payments almost always leave traces somewhere else. I started with the easiest place to look. The county's online business registry. Every legitimate contractor performing recurring work usually appears somewhere in public records. Landscapers, electricians, maintenance companies, engineers. Their registrations, licenses, and business filings are all part of ordinary government databases. The landscaping contractor listed in the meeting packet checked out immediately. Local company, years in business, multiple commercial clients. Nothing unusual. The irrigation contractor looked equally legitimate. Then I searched the consulting company that appeared repeatedly beside administrative services. Silver Oak Community Solutions. The name sounded professional, almost too professional. Its online presence consisted of a simple website containing little more than a logo, a generic mission statement, and a contact form with no employee directory. No photographs. No completed projects. No client testimonials. Odd. Companies receiving substantial recurring payments from homeowner associations usually advertised aggressively. This one barely seemed to exist. I searched the state business registry. The company was registered only 4 years earlier. That date immediately caught my attention. For years, the same period during which community improvements had suddenly begun increasing every budget cycle. Coincidence? Possibly. Enough to accuse anyone? Not even close. Still, I wrote the incorporation date beside the first budget where expenses noticeably increased. The timelines matched almost perfectly. I clicked through additional filings. Registered agent. Business address. Annual reports. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. But something quietly bothered me. The listed office address wasn't inside a commercial office park. It belonged to a small professional building on the edge of town that housed accountants, insurance agents, and several independent consultants. I switched to satellite view. Only one suite carried no visible business sign. Interesting. Not proof. Just interesting. Late that afternoon, I drove past the building without stopping. The parking lot was nearly empty except for 3 vehicles. The suite number listed in the registry displayed only a frosted glass door with no company logo, no reception area visible through the window, and no indication that a business handling significant HOA consulting contracts actually operated there. Maybe they worked remotely. Maybe the sign had been removed. There were dozens of perfectly innocent explanations. But after spending years inspecting construction projects, I'd learned one lesson that applied almost everywhere. Real operations usually leave visible evidence. People, equipment, deliveries, activity. This place looked like it had been waiting for someone who never arrived. As I drove back toward Maple Ridge, I noticed Linda standing outside the clubhouse speaking with 2 board members. Their conversation stopped the moment my truck passed. All 3 looked in my direction before pretending to continue discussing landscaping plans. Perhaps I was imagining it, or perhaps I had simply started noticing details that had always been there. That evening, I pinned another sheet of paper onto the growing collection covering my dining room wall. Budgets, assessment increases, meeting minutes, business registrations, dates, addresses. Individually, every piece appeared harmless. Together, they were beginning to resemble something far more organized. I still hadn't found missing money. I hadn't uncovered fraud. I hadn't exposed anyone. But for the first time since opening that unexpected HOA invoice, I stopped asking whether the board's numbers made sense. Instead, I found myself asking a far more dangerous question. Who, exactly, benefited every time those numbers quietly became larger? Every investigation reaches a moment when curiosity stops being enough. You either walk away with unanswered questions, or you accept that the next answer might change everything you thought you knew. By the beginning of the second week, I had crossed that line without even realizing it. The business records had given me names. The budgets had given me numbers. What I needed now was a connection. Wednesday afternoon, while organizing another stack of printed documents, I noticed something I should have seen days earlier. Every annual budget packet included a list of board members who had served during that fiscal year. Most homeowners probably skipped over those pages without a second thought. I didn't. Names matter. People change. Relationships don't always. I lined up the last 4 reports across my dining room table and compared each board roster. Linda Brooks appeared every year as HOA president. The treasurer changed once. 2 directors rotated out after their terms expired. One position remained remarkably consistent. Board secretary, Daniel Pierce. His name appeared on nearly every set of approved meeting minutes. Nothing unusual about that, until I searched the state business filings one more time. The registered agent for Silver Oak Community Solutions wasn't Daniel Pierce, but the mailing address attached to one of the company's annual filings led to a post office box that had also appeared on another public document, connected to Daniel's small bookkeeping business. I stared at the screen. Then I searched again. Different filing. Same post office box. That still wasn't evidence of wrongdoing. Many people use shared mailing services. Small businesses often rented identical postal boxes in the same building. Coincidences happened. Engineers survive by respecting coincidence until evidence proves otherwise. Still, I wrote the address onto my growing timeline. 1 hour later, I was reviewing archived neighborhood newsletters stored on the HOA website. Most contained announcements about holiday decorating contests, garage sales, and volunteer events. Then one issue from 3 years earlier caught my attention. Congratulations to Board Secretary Daniel Pierce on launching his new community consulting business. The newsletter included a smiling photograph of Daniel shaking hands with Linda outside the clubhouse. Silver Oak Community Solutions. The company now receiving recurring consulting payments from the HOA. Again, nothing illegal. People are allowed to own businesses. Associations are allowed to hire consultants. The important question wasn't whether Daniel owned the company. It was whether homeowners had ever been told that the board was approving payments to a business connected to one of its own officers. I searched every meeting packet, every disclosure statement, every conflict of interest form available on the HOA website. Nothing. No discussion. No abstention recorded during budget votes. No disclosure language. Only unanimous approvals. By late evening, my office wall had become a map of dates, names, addresses, and arrows connecting one document to another. It still looked incomplete, but for the first time, the pieces were beginning to point in the same direction. My phone vibrated. An unknown number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. Mr. Carter? The voice sounded cautious. Yes. I'd rather not give my name over the phone. I remained silent. I heard you've been asking questions about the HOA budget. My pulse slowed instead of quickening. Years of engineering inspections had taught me never to interrupt someone willing to volunteer information. The caller continued. You're looking in the right reports. A brief pause followed. But you're looking at the wrong budget. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I lowered the phone and stared at the disconnected screen. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into another quiet evening. Porch lights flickered on one by one. Children were called home for dinner. Sprinklers hissed softly across perfectly maintained lawns. Everything looked normal. Yet somewhere inside this ordinary suburban community, someone knew there was another budget. One that homeowners had never been meant to see. And for the first time since this investigation began, I realized I wasn't the only person quietly waiting for the truth to come into the light. People imagine that secrets are hidden inside locked safes or encrypted computers. In my experience, the most valuable secrets usually arrive in the plainest possible envelope. The anonymous phone call replayed in my mind for the rest of the night. You're looking at the wrong budget. Whoever had called wasn't trying to scare me. They were trying to redirect me. The next morning, I arrived at work earlier than usual, but concentrating on engineering drawings proved impossible. Every calculation in front of me eventually led back to the same unanswered question. If there was another budget, where had it been presented? More importantly, who had access to it? At lunchtime, I drove back toward Maple Ridge instead of stopping for food. The summer sun reflected off freshly painted mailboxes while sprinklers sent arcs of water across perfectly trimmed lawns. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested financial deception. That was probably why it had worked for so long. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a large white envelope resting against my front door. No postage, no return address, just my name written neatly across the front. I stood there for several seconds without touching it. Then I carried it inside. The envelope contained fewer than 20 sheets of paper. None bore an HOA letterhead. None were signed. Across the first page, however, someone had typed 2 simple words. Working budget. I immediately compared it with the official budget sitting on my dining room table. The formatting looked almost identical. Same categories. Same sequence. Same accounting style. But the numbers were completely different. Several expense categories matched the public version almost exactly. Others did not. Community improvements had detailed subcategories instead of a single total. Consulting expenses listed specific payment amounts. Administrative costs were broken into individual line items. One recurring entry immediately caught my attention. Strategic Advisory Services. Monthly payment. No explanation. No description. Only a vendor identification code that never appeared in the public documents. I flipped another page. There it was again. Different month. Same payment. Another page. Same code. 12 consecutive monthly entries. Whoever prepared this document had never expected homeowners to see it. My pulse remained steady, but years of reviewing construction contracts had trained me to recognize one critical difference between a draft document and a presentation document. Drafts usually contain details. Public summaries remove them. Someone had deliberately simplified the version distributed to homeowners. That alone wasn't necessarily improper. Organizations often condensed internal working papers before presenting final budgets. The important question was whether the removed information changed the meaning of the numbers. I continued comparing every page. Most differences involved harmless formatting. Then I reached the consulting section. The public budget reported one annual consulting figure. The working budget divided that same total among 3 separate recipients. One name belonged to the landscaping consultant I had already verified. Another matched a reserve planning specialist. The third vendor identification number corresponded to the same consulting company I had been researching, Silver Oak Community Solutions. Beside the vendor code appeared a short internal note. Board authorization only. I read those 3 words several times. Not because they proved misconduct. They didn't. But they proved something equally important. There were documents the board had never shared with homeowners despite repeated claims that the published budget contained everything residents needed to know. Tucked inside the final page was a small handwritten note. No signature. Only one sentence. Ask why the audit committee never received this version. I slowly leaned back in my chair. Until that moment, I had believed I was following suspicious numbers. Now I understood I was following 2 entirely different versions of reality. One budget had been carefully presented to homeowners. Another had quietly guided the board's financial decisions behind closed doors. Outside my window, the neighborhood remained peaceful. Children laughed in the distance. A lawn mower hummed somewhere down the block. Linda Brooks drove past my house without slowing, completely unaware that an ordinary white envelope now sat on my dining room table. She still believed this investigation was about a higher HOA fee. It wasn't anymore. It was about discovering why a board that insisted everything was transparent had been operating with a budget most homeowners had never even known existed. The easiest mistake an investigator can make is believing that finding evidence is the same thing as winning. It isn't. Evidence only matters if it survives daylight. That meant I wasn't interested in surprising Linda Brooks in a private conversation. I wanted every homeowner in Maple Ridge Estates to hear the same facts at the same time. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. Normally, only a handful of residents attended. Most meetings lasted less than an hour. Landscaping updates, pool maintenance, holiday decorations. Routine motions passed with little discussion before everyone returned home. This meeting was going to be different. I spent the next 2 days preparing exactly as I would before presenting an engineering report to a city council. Every document received a numbered tab. Every budget comparison went into chronological order. I highlighted only the figures that could be supported by official records. Assumptions stayed out of the binder. Opinions stayed out of the binder. If I couldn't verify something with documentation, it didn't belong in my presentation. By Thursday afternoon, my dining room wall was empty again. Everything that had once been covered in sticky notes, arrows, and handwritten theories now sat inside a single black 3-ring binder. Clean. Organized. Defensible. At 6:45 that evening, I walked toward the clubhouse carrying the binder beneath one arm. The parking lot was already fuller than usual. Small groups of neighbors stood outside talking quietly, several holding copies of the same assessment notices I had received. Apparently, I wasn't the only homeowner asking questions anymore. Inside, folding chairs filled the meeting room in neat rows facing the board's long conference table. Linda Brooks sat in the center seat, perfectly composed as always. Daniel Pierce arranged financial packets while the remaining board members exchanged polite conversation, apparently expecting another routine meeting. Linda noticed me as soon as I entered. Her smile appeared instantly. Professional. Measured. Almost welcoming. "I see you decided to attend," she said. "I wouldn't miss the budget discussion." Her expression paused for barely a second. "We don't have a budget discussion on tonight's agenda. I think we will." Without another word, I found a seat near the center of the room. By 7 o'clock, nearly every chair had been filled. Conversations faded as Linda tapped her gavel lightly against the table. The meeting began exactly as expected. approval of previous minutes, landscaping update, pool maintenance, holiday decorating committee. Everything moved efficiently, almost mechanically. Then came the homeowner comment period. Linda glanced across the room. Does anyone wish to address the board? I stood. The room became unexpectedly quiet. I have a question regarding the recent assessment increases. Linda folded her hands together. The board has already explained those adjustments. I've read every published budget from the last 4 years. A few neighbors shifted in their seats. I've also compared those budgets with the meeting minutes, vendor records, business registrations, and publicly available financial documents. Daniel stopped turning pages. Linda's smile remained, but it no longer reached her eyes. I believe homeowners deserve clarification regarding several recurring expenditures. She leaned toward her microphone. Mr. Carter, if you have a specific question, please ask it. I do. I placed the binder gently on the podium provided for homeowner comments. The sound echoed softly through the room. I'd like to begin with community improvements. No one spoke. I opened the binder to the first tab. Projected charts. Budget summaries. Official meeting minutes. Each page rested neatly behind the next. Everything documented. Everything verifiable. Everything ready. For the first time since receiving that unexpected HOA assessment, I wasn't relying on suspicion anymore. I was relying on records. And judging by the silence spreading across the room, Linda Brooks had just realized that whatever happened next was no longer a private disagreement between one homeowner and the HOA president. It was about to become a public examination of the board's own financial story, one page at a time.